same things happen over and over again through time for basically the same reasons. A lot of these things happen once in a lifetime. If you don't go back and see how they worked over time, then you're in trouble. So there's a pattern that happens over and over again, and we're in a particular spot in the pattern. And then to understand it, not just because it happened before, but to understand mechanistically how it happens, and then one has a sense of how to deal with it. Pandemics come along occasionally, but let me say the three most important circumstances that existed before we had the downturn, which was caused by a pandemic, but any downturn would have produced the same results. The three most important things that are happening in the world now are that we're at the end, late in a long-term debt cycle in which central banks cannot control monetary policy the same way. They can't lower interest rates. They can't get money to a lot of people who need the money in the traditional way. So just like in 1929 to 1932, there was a debt crisis that came as a result of an excessive amount of debt in the boom year. And then when you have that in 1932, we hit zero interest rate. And when they hit zero interest rates in 32, like in 2008, central bank prints money and buys financial assets. And so what happens in these cycles is that normally central banks can stimulate the economy by lowering interest rates. But when you hit zero interest rates, that doesn't work. So the last time it hit zero interest rates was 1932. And what they did in 1932 was the same thing they did in 2008. And that is that the central banks prints a lot of money and buys government bonds. And so we're doing that now. So the important thing to know about this crisis is that in order to get the checks that we're needing, now where will those checks come from? So there'll be checks from the government. Where does all this money come from? So the government, when they say, I'm going to pay more for unemployment insurance, or I'm going to give you a loan for a small business, where do they get the money from? Well, they either tax it, but if they tax it, that's bad. So the government, they can borrow it. That's what a deficit is. The government runs a deficit. And then the question is, who's going to borrow it when everybody's financially strapped? And the Federal Reserve says they have the power to print money, and they will say, I will borrow it. I will lend you the money. So the Federal Reserve is lending the money, and it is also lending others the money. But the main thing to know about this, stepping back for the big picture, is that every individual, every company, and every government has a certain amount of money that comes in the form of income, a certain amount of expenses, then a certain amount of saving. So you do individually, and it works the same way for everyone, so that if their income falls to be less than their expenditures, they're in trouble unless they have a good saving. So all around the world, there are lots of entities that are in trouble in that way. So the government, the U.S. government, want to give checks to people. Now, it's difficult to decide who gets it, who doesn't get it. But if they don't give checks to people or to companies, those will go bankrupt. So what we're going through is the same process as happened in the 1930 to 1945 period. So as I was saying, there are three important things. That is one. The second is large wealth gap. Third is that we have a rising power in the form of China emerging to compete or challenge the United States leadership. So when you have these three things together, it's a challenging mix, and it's happened repeatedly.
So what can the average person take away from that? They don't have bonds. They don't think like that. They may not even understand what their 401k is, or they may not even have a 401k. So how do they navigate?
It's the same for every individual, same for every company. If you understand this, then you understand, well, there are three things. The first is look at your income, your expenses, and your savings, and then do a stress test so that you get yourself secure. If you were to lose your income, or if the income were to fall beyond a certain level, and you play that out, maybe that means you go get unemployment insurance or whatever. How long can you live in an acceptable lifestyle? And do you have a saving that is adequate for that? So what you do is you calculate, if I lived in a simpler lifestyle and I had this amount of earnings, how many months could I live acceptably? Then you look at, what do you put the money in? What do you save in?
the average American, if they're hit with a surprise $500 bill, they're not able to make it. I think about personal finance the way I think about health. And right now, I worry that people are outsourcing everything to somebody else, to the government. And what I'm desperately trying to figure out for myself is what level of proactiveness of learning about their health they can do to try to weather this storm.
I mean, you know the parts, right? It's income, expenses, and savings. Now you can go get the money. Maybe the money comes in and you say, okay, my unemployment benefits are going to be this, but those are the parts. Then the issue is how clever are you at dealing with those? But back to the average man in terms of his finances, I would say the important thing is those three elements: to have a plan, and maybe to have a plan with both your family. You know, how do you get down when things got tough, you know, and then you have to look at, you know, what happens in policy. Well, policy depends on the person. Some people would understand more about policy than other people, you know, so it depends on what they're able to do well.